The Yakhchals of Persia, ancient ice houses that defied the desert. The desert, the heat, and the need for cold. Settle yourself in, take a slow breath, and imagine the vast deserts of ancient Persia. The sun is heavy overhead, unrelenting, and the air seems to shimmer with heat. It is a place where shade itself feels like a luxury, and where water, cool and fresh, is not merely a convenience, but a treasure. For most people today, cooling is so simple we hardly think of it. A refrigerator hums quietly in the background of our kitchens. Ice cubes clink against the sides of a glass, and milk can be stored for days without concern. But in the ancient world, in a land where temperatures could soar beyond what most people would consider tolerable, cold was not just comfort, it was survival. The Persians of antiquity faced this challenge with ingenuity. They did not accept the desert's demand for heat as a final answer. Instead, they asked themselves a simple, practical question: how can we store winter's ice into the burning summer? And from that question came one of history's most overlooked achievements, the Yakhchal, or ice pit. These structures, humble in appearance and yet monumental in function, were the first refrigerators in human history. The Yakhchal was not a single invention in isolation. It was the culmination of necessity, environment, and a keen observation of nature. It began with the reality of Persian geography. Much of ancient Persia, especially around present-day Iran, was arid, desert, and mountainous. Winters could be bitterly cold, particularly near the highlands, while summers were punishingly hot. This cycle of extreme seasons created a natural possibility. If one could capture the ice and snow of winter and keep it sealed away from the grasp of the summer sun, then one could enjoy chilled water, preserved food, and even cooled storage long after the seasons had shifted. To you, the modern listener, this might sound like a quaint curiosity, but think of it from the perspective of survival. In the heart of summer, fruit would spoil quickly, milk would sour, meat, if not salted or dried, would be wasted. The ability to store ice meant more than indulgence. It meant extending the life of food, providing cold water and punishing heat, and even easing medical treatments where cooling was beneficial. These were not luxuries, but quiet revolutions in daily life. The structures themselves are fascinating. From the outside, a Yakhchal might look like a great mud brick dome rising above the flat desert. They were often between 15 to 20 meters high, with a wide base that narrowed upward, resembling an enormous beehive sitting in the sand. The walls were astonishingly thick, sometimes up to 2 meters, made from a special mortar called saruj. This mixture, a blend of clay, sand, egg whites, lime, goat hair, and ash, created a material so durable and insulating that some Yakhchals still stand over 2,000 years later. Inside, the structure plunged downward into a deep subterranean chamber. It was here, below ground level, that ice was stored. The thickness of the walls, the conical dome shape, and the subterranean depth all worked together to maintain a consistently cool environment, even when the desert sun blazed overhead. In winter, ice and snow would be gathered, sometimes brought down from nearby mountains, sometimes harvested from purpose-built shallow canals that froze during the cold nights. The blocks of ice were dragged into the Yakhchal and stacked, sometimes with layers of straw between them, to slow melting and allow air to circulate gently. The science behind this might sound complex, but in truth, it is rooted in simplicity and patience. The conical design was not accidental. The wide base allowed the ice to be stored in bulk, while the narrowing top reduced exposure to hot air and sunlight. The dome also encouraged air circulation, with cooler air naturally settling at the bottom. At night, when desert temperatures dropped significantly, the venting system allowed hot air to escape and cool air to sink in, reinforcing the preservation effect. In essence, the Persians were building structures that functioned as massive, natural evaporative coolers and insulation chambers. But there is more. These yakhchals were often paired with another Persian innovation, the cannet. A cannet was an underground water channel, sometimes stretching for miles, that carried water from mountain aquifers into villages and towns. Because the cannets ran underground, they avoided the evaporative losses of surface canals. The water, cool from its subterranean journey, sometimes passed near or even through yakhchals, helping keep the interior temperature stable. It was a brilliant pairing, architecture and engineering working together for a singular goal: coolness in a desert that knew no mercy. As you sit here, listening to this history unfold, you might begin to imagine the scene. It is the 5th century BCE, during the reign of the Achaemenid Empire, perhaps under Darius or Xerxes. A worker, his face lined from sun and labor, pushes a block of ice down into the dark chamber of a yakhchal. His sandals crunch on the straw already spread along the floor. He wipes his brow and looks up at the wide dome above him, its smooth earthen surface faintly glowing in the morning light. Above ground, the village awaits summer. Dates hang heavy on palms. Sheep graze under the thin shadows of acacia trees, and the air vibrates with cicadas. Yet below the surface, hidden from the desert's reach, lies the answer: cold, waiting for when it will be most needed. For ordinary people, the results were quietly transformative. A sip of chilled water in July was not just refreshing, it was life-giving. The storage of perishable foods extended diets beyond what was seasonally possible. Medical uses, though primitive, benefited as well. Fevers could be eased with cooling cloths dipped in icy water. And for the wealthy, the possibilities extended to entertainment and status. Feasts could include chilled drinks, fruits served cold, and desserts that shocked visitors and used to such luxury in the desert. In some ways, the yakhchal became not just a tool of survival, but a symbol of cultural refinement. If you think carefully, you might realize that this technology represented more than practicality. It showed a profound understanding of nature's cycles. The Persians were not conquering the desert so much as learning to live in harmony with it. They accepted the cold of winter as a gift and devised a way to stretch that gift across the months of unbearable heat. This is what makes the story of the Yakhchals so quietly remarkable. They were not machines, nor did they rely on fuel, electricity, or elaborate moving parts. They were patient, enduring, and effective, much like the people who built them. Yet as you picture these domes rising out of the sands, and imagine the hidden chambers filled with carefully stored ice, a question begins to surface. How far did this knowledge travel? Were the Persians alone in building such structures, or did their techniques spread, influencing other civilizations along the Silk routes? And perhaps more intriguingly, how many other forgotten technologies, solutions so simple and yet so elegant, lie buried in the sands of time, waiting for us to remember them? Now that you have settled into the idea of a Yakhchal, a massive mud brick dome filled with ice, let us move deeper into the story. You may already be imagining it rising from the desert floor, but what you might not yet appreciate is the sheer complexity of building one. These were not temporary shelters or makeshift pits. They were monumental undertakings that demanded skill, organization, and knowledge passed down through generations. Imagine, for a moment, the construction site. You are standing in an arid plain somewhere in central Persia, perhaps near Yazd or Kerman. Around you, men and women gather clay, lime, ash, goat hair, and water. The air smells faintly of earth and fire. Slowly, they mix these ingredients into a sticky, resilient plaster called sarouj. This mixture was no accident. Egg whites gave it binding strength. Goat hair provided fiber to resist cracking. Ash and lime made it resistant to moisture. Together, they formed one of the earliest examples of engineered mortar, designed not for beauty but for survival. The workers began with a wide, circular foundation, digging deep into the earth to create a pit that would become the ice chamber. Layer by layer, they laid bricks of mud and clay, each one coated in sarouj. As the walls rose, their thickness grew astonishing, sometimes more than 2 meters. Such thickness meant insulation, keeping the interior cool even when the desert sun blazed at 40 degrees Celsius or more. The dome was not only practical but symbolic. Its curved surface resisted collapse and directed hot air upward, away from the ice below. From a distance, the structure looked like an enormous beehive. Yet unlike the fragile hives of bees, this construction was meant to endure centuries. Many of them, in fact, still stand today, their earthen shapes weathered but intact, testimony to the builder's skill. The interior was simple and purposeful. The pit at the bottom formed the coldest zone, where blocks of ice were stacked. Narrow stairways sometimes led down, though in many cases the chamber could only be reached by lowering materials with ropes. Straw was spread between layers of ice, not only to prevent sticking but also to absorb meltwater. Some Yakhchals included drainage channels to guide away excess water, preventing flooding or weakening of the base. Yet building the Yakhchal was only the first challenge. The true test came with maintaining it. The desert was not kind to human efforts. Heat pressed down, winds carried sand, and the cycles of day and night constantly shifted temperatures. The Persians had to be attentive caretakers of their ice houses. Each winter, the process of ice gathering began. Shallow pools were dug near the Yakhchal, often lined with clay to hold water. At night, when desert temperatures dropped below freezing, the water hardened into thin sheets of ice. Workers would rise before dawn, before the sun could undo the night's work, and carefully cut the ice into blocks. These blocks, sometimes only a few inches thick, were hauled into the Yakhchal. Over time, layer upon layer built up into a massive frozen stockpile. In places where mountains rose nearby, snow and ice were also brought down from higher altitudes. Imagine men leading donkeys laden with heavy baskets of snow, trudging along narrow paths, their breath steaming in the frosty air. The journey was long, and much of the snow would melt along the way, but what remained was still precious. In this way, villages without natural freezing pools could still benefit from the bounty of winter. Inside the Yakhchal, workers took care to arrange the ice with precision. The layers of straw provided cushioning and air circulation. The chamber was sealed tightly, with only narrow openings at the top for ventilation. On particularly hot days, the keepers would check the structure, adjusting air vents to ensure that heat did not accumulate. It was not unlike tending a fire. Only here, the goal was to tend to the absence of heat, to guard a pocket of cold in the heart of a desert. For villagers, the maintenance of the Yakhchal was a shared responsibility. The ice was not meant for a single household, but for the community. Water carriers, merchants, and healers all had their turn collecting from its stores. Records suggest that in some towns, access was regulated by elders or overseers who decided how much ice each family received. Wealthier families might gain more, especially if they contributed labor or resources, but even the poor benefited from the trickle of cold water that eased summer's burden. There is something quietly humbling about this. In our modern world, refrigeration is personal. Each family, each home, even each dormitory room, has its own appliance humming away. But for the Persians, cooling was communal. The Yakhchal belonged to everyone, and its success relied on cooperation. If one family took too much, others would go without. If workers failed to tend the pools in winter, the stock would be low in summer. Thus, these structures were not merely technical marvels, but also symbols of shared survival. The benefits extended beyond simple refreshment. Food preservation was critical. Meat could be stored longer, fruit could be kept cool, and milk could last for days instead of hours. In regions where crops were seasonal and livestock were precious, this extended window of preservation meant fewer losses and more stability. A Yakhchal did not guarantee abundance, but it buffered communities against scarcity. Medicine, too, found its uses for ice. Though Persian physicians lacked the clinical knowledge of modern science, they understood the soothing power of cold. Fevers could be calmed with compresses dipped in icy water. Inflammation from wounds or insect bites was relieved by cooling. For the ill, a sip of chilled water was more than comfort. It was healing. And yet, luxury played its part as well. In the courts of kings and nobles, Yakhchals provided a way to astonish guests. Imagine being served sherbet, flavored with rose water and cooled with ice, on a blazing summer day in Persepolis. The shock of cold sweetness would have been both a delight and a display of wealth. To have ice in the desert was not only practical, it was power. All of this raises a subtle question. Were the Yakhchals simply Persian inventions, or did they connect to a broader world of ancient cooling techniques? Evidence suggests that other civilizations, from China to India, had their own methods of preserving ice. But the Persian structures were unique in their scale, their durability, and their communal nature. Unlike temporary pits or fleeting stockpiles, the Yakhchal was built to last. As you reflect on these great domes, standing silent under the desert sky, perhaps you begin to see them not just as buildings, but as acts of defiance. They were human hands shaping clay into a promise that even in the most unforgiving climate, cold could be preserved. But one wonders, did this technology remain confined to Persia? Did traders along the silk routes carry not only spices and silks, but also the secrets of ice storage? And if so, what echoes of the Yakhchal can be found in the cooling practices of distant lands? You've now pictured the Yakhchals, those towering earthen domes, the thick sarouge plaster walls, the layered ice and straw, and the shared survival they provided to Persian communities. But no culture exists in isolation. Persia was not a hidden kingdom cut off from the world. It was a crossroads, a land that touched the Mediterranean to the west, India to the east, and Central Asia to the north. The Persian Empire's strength was not only in its armies, but also in its networks of trade, culture, and knowledge. And knowledge has a way of traveling quietly, hidden in the baggage of merchants, the stories of travelers, and the habits of migrants. The silk routes, those arteries of exchange stretching across continents, were not only for silk, spices, and precious metals. They carried ideas, technologies, and simple, practical solutions to everyday problems. Among those ideas, the preservation of ice found its way into new lands. In India, for instance, we find evidence of ice pits and early ice-making techniques by the Mughal period. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Indian rulers and nobles enjoyed chilled drinks and flavored ices, even in climates where summer heat rivaled Persia's. Some of this knowledge may have been influenced by earlier Persian traditions. The Mughal Empire itself, after all, had roots in Central Asia and deep connections with Persian culture. Persian engineers, artisans, and architects were employed at Mughal courts, bringing with them techniques that included not just gardens and palaces, but also methods of cooling. Further east, in China, the practice of ice storage dates back centuries. As early as the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, records describe the construction of ice cellars for the royal court. During the Tang dynasty, ice was stored in underground pits insulated with straw and earth, remarkably similar to Persian techniques. While it is difficult to say whether these Chinese practices developed independently or were influenced by Persian Yakhchals, The resemblance suggests a shared human impulse to capture the cold of winter and make it last. To the west, the story is equally intriguing. In ancient Greece, wealthy households sometimes stored snow brought from mountains, covering it with hay or leaves to preserve it. Aristotle himself wrote about the cooling properties of evaporation, demonstrating that the principles underpinning the Yakshal were understood, at least in theory, far beyond Persia. Later, in Rome, ice and snow were imported from the Apennine Mountains and stored in deep pits. There, too, the wealthy delighted in chilled drinks and snow-cooled fruits. These practices were not identical to the Yakshal, but they echoed the same desire to tame the climate, if only briefly. Yet the Persian Yakhchal was distinctive in its communal and architectural scale. While Greek and Roman ice storage remained largely a luxury of the elite, Persia's Yakhchals were community-based, serving villages and towns. This difference is telling. It reflects Persia's orientation towards sustainable, shared infrastructure, exemplified by their qanats and other irrigation systems. Their empire, vast and diverse, thrived on such innovations. Even in the Arabian Peninsula, knowledge of ice storage trickled in. By the early Islamic period, texts record the building of ice houses by al-Thawj, particularly in cities with Persian influence like Baghdad. Caliphs and nobles enjoyed chilled sherbets and rosewater ices, and some cities imported ice from mountains to fill their stores. The continuity is unmistakable. Persia's legacy carried into the Islamic Golden Age, where science, medicine, and daily life were shaped by centuries of practical innovations. One could even argue that the Yakhchal's principles foreshadowed the ice houses of Europe in later centuries. In 17th and 18th century England and France, great estates built underground ice houses, vaulted chambers where ice was packed with straw. These resembled the Persian model, though constructed with brick and stone rather than mud plaster. Whether the knowledge arrived by direct transmission or through parallel invention, the similarities remain striking. The spread of cooling technology also highlights a deeper truth, that civilizations are linked not only by grand wars or dynasties, but also by mundane needs. The desire for cold water, preserved food, and relief from heat unites humanity across time and space. When you follow the trail of ice, you discover a web of connections that is as important as the trade of silk or spices. But what of the people themselves? How did ordinary travelers, merchants, or workers encounter these technologies? Consider a caravan making its way from Persia into Central Asia. Merchants carried dates, rugs, and ceramics. At night, around the fire, stories are told. One merchant describes how his village keeps ice in the summer using a great dome of mud brick. Another listens, intrigued, and wonders if such a structure could be built at home. Perhaps the knowledge is not carried in blueprints or scrolls, but in memory and word of mouth. Across generations, these simple conversations ripple outward, shaping practices in faraway lands. And so, the Yakhchal becomes not just a Persian achievement, but part of a larger human narrative, the story of how societies adapt, borrow, and blend ideas. When you see a 17th century ice house in England, you are seeing a distant cousin of the Persian dome. When you read of Mughal emperors sipping sherbet, you are hearing the echo of Persian villagers cutting ice in the night. Yet for all its spread, the Yakhchal remains uniquely Persian in one profound way: its endurance. Many of the domes still stand, weathered but unbroken, in Iran's deserts. Their survival testifies not only to the strength of Saruj plaster, but also to the persistence of communal memory. These were not temporary solutions. They were permanent answers to an eternal question: how to live with both heat and cold in a land of extremes. Now pause and picture again the Persian desert. The sun sinks toward the horizon, staining the sky with gold and violet. A Yakhchal rises in silhouette, its dome smooth and silent. Within, the chamber holds its secret: ice, resting under layers of straw, waiting to be drawn upon. The merchants have long since moved on. The kings and empires have passed into history, but the structure remains. It is a quiet witness to centuries of human ingenuity. And so, as we trace the journey of this technology across lands and centuries, one question remains open. If such simple yet powerful innovations could travel so far and influence so many, how many other forgotten techniques, now buried under centuries of progress, once connected us in ways we scarcely imagine? You have followed the story of the Yakhchal from its beginnings in the Persian desert, through the methods of its construction and maintenance, to its spread across continents and centuries. Now, in this final section, let us pause, not to marvel at the grandiosity of kings or the noise of armies, but to reflect on the quiet lessons these domes of earth and straw still whisper to us today. The first lesson is simplicity. The Yakhchal required no fuel, no constant human intervention, and no sophisticated machinery. It harnessed natural cycles: winter frost, desert nights, the insulating properties of thick walls, and locked them into a form that worked with, not against, the environment. This is important because it reminds us that progress in history has not always been about speed or complexity. Sometimes, the most enduring solutions are those that imitate nature, gently guiding it rather than overpowering it. Consider for a moment how we cool our homes and preserve our food today. Air conditioners hum relentlessly. Refrigerators consume electricity around the clock, and vast amounts of energy are spent on artificial cold. The Persians had none of this, yet they achieved a kind of balance. Their domes were carbon neutral before the term even existed. A Yakhchal stood quietly, absorbing heat, venting air, and preserving cold, all through geometry, material science, and patience. The second lesson is community. A Yakhchal was rarely for one person alone. It belonged to villages, to towns, to shared life. In a world that often emphasizes personal ownership and private consumption, it is striking to imagine cooling as a communal resource. Everyone contributed to filling it with ice in the winter. Everyone benefited from its stores in the summer. This collective approach ensured survival and also reinforced bonds between neighbors. In times of scarcity, sharing cold water was more than kindness, it was solidarity. The third lesson lies in endurance. Many Yakhchals remained standing after more than 2 millennia. Their survival is not just architectural, it is cultural. Even as dynasties rose and fell, even as religions and languages shifted, the domes stayed. Their continued use well into the 20th century shows how practical knowledge can outlive empires. When you stand before one today, you are standing before a timeline of human resilience, carved in mud and lime. But perhaps the most profound lesson is about memory. The Yakhchal is a reminder of how much of our past is forgotten, overshadowed by louder stories of conquest and kingship. We are taught of Alexander's campaigns, of Xerxes' invasions, of the great palaces and battles. Yet the quiet act of storing ice in the desert may have had as much impact on daily lives as the outcome of any war. For history is not only the story of rulers, it is also the story of survival, of the countless small decisions that allowed ordinary people to endure heat, hunger, and hardship. Imagine again, if you will, a Persian summer. The air shimmers, the earth cracks with dryness, and animals gather in the shade. A villager, weary from work, descends into the cool shadows of a Yakhchal. He lifts a block of ice, its surface rough and crystalline, and chips away a piece. He places it in a clay jug of water, swirls it gently, and takes a sip. The shock of cold spreads through his body. It is not luxury. It is not spectacle. It is survival, and it is also relief. For him, in that moment, the Yakhchal is as significant as any temple or palace. Now extend your imagination further, across centuries. A Mughal emperor in India sips rose-flavored ice sherbet. A Roman noble eats chilled fruit in a villa. A 19th century English lord opens the brick door of his estate's ice house. Though separated by thousands of miles and centuries, they are all linked by a single human desire to capture a piece of winter and carry it into the summer. The Yakhchal is the thread that ties them together, reminding us of our shared humanity. What, then, can we take from these ancient domes today? At a time when climate change challenges our relationship with the natural world, the Yakhchal stands as a gentle teacher. It shows us that cooling need not be destructive, that balance with nature is possible, and that human ingenuity can be humble rather than wasteful. Perhaps modern engineers and architects might look again to these domes for inspiration, not to replicate them exactly, but to remember the principles they embody. In Yazd, Iran, where some of the oldest Yakhchals still stand, tourists now visit them as curiosities. Guides explain their history, architects marvel at their design, and locals remember their use. Yet beyond curiosity lies a deeper question. If the Persians could master cooling in one of the hottest places on Earth without machines, why do we, with all our technology, still struggle to live sustainably with our environment? So, as you drift now between thought and rest, carry this question with you. The Yakhchal, quiet and unassuming, may hold not only the memory of cold deserts, but also the key to imagining gentler futures. And perhaps, when you next open your refrigerator, hear in the soft hum of its motor the echo of something older and quieter, the whisper of mud domes in Persia, still guarding ice against the desert sun.